We'll just wait another minute before we start. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Canadian Foundation for Dietetic Research webinar, Sustainability in Dietetic Education, Training and Practice in Canada. My name is Marcy Cooper, and I'm the co-chair of the Canadian Foundation for Dietetic Research Board of Directors, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the Board of Directors of CFDR, we welcome you today to our third webinar in our brand new webinar series. CFDR supports innovative research projects in nutrition and dietetics to enhance dietetic practice and ultimately to improve the nutritional health of all Canadians. We have invested in nutrition and dietetics research, about $3 million. We have had 29 peer-reviewed publications supported research since 2011. And we have supported 125 research teams. As a not-for-profit organization, we rely on the support of our partners, such as industry and individual support. And if you choose and want to donate, just go to cfdr.ca and there's a donate button. So the basis of why we exist is to support grants. We are currently in the process of our 2026 grant competition. We will have our full proposals in March 4th, 2026. But if you are thinking of wanting to do research, our 2027 competition will open in October 2026. So we want to promote our brand new CFDR Research Showcase, which is taking place March 4th and 11th. 2 afternoons, 1 to 4 p.m. on March 4th. Our keynote speaker will be Dr. Kathy Morley. On March 11th, our keynote speaker will be Dr. Sophie DeRoche. And the rest of the afternoon will be fantastic research presentations on both days on a variety of topics. So please register. It is free. You can use the QR code there or go to cfdr.ca/research-showcase to find out the information. As I said, it's free, so please sign up. We expect it to be a really interesting afternoons, both days. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram. We are there and you'll get up-to-date information. So just a bit of a housekeeping note for today. Please feel free to type questions in the question and answer as we go. We'll do our best to address as many as possible. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Jessica Wegner is an associate professor in the School of Nutrition and an associate director of the Center for Studies in Food Security at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's a registered dietitian and dietetic educator, teaching at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her research focuses on sustainability, education in dietetics, and sustainability in dietetics practice. More broadly, Jessica has been leading a mapping project on sustainability education within accredited dietetic and nutrition programs across multiple countries and working with Canadian co-investigators, Dr. Liesl Carlson and Tracy Everett, to examine the social impact potential of dietitians in contributing to sustainability. They're in the final stages of developing a podcast series featuring exemplar dietitians who are integrating sustainability across various areas of practice, including education and research. Liesl Carlson is a professor and interim director in the School of Nutrition and Dietetics at Acadia University, a registered dietitian and ICDA Food Sustainability Initiative team member. Her research on sustainability, food systems, and nutrition currently examines the social impact potential of dietitians to contribute to sustainability and the circular and pedagogical supports required in education. She co-chaired Dietitians of Canada SFS leadership team from 2016 to 2019, and for this work was recognized for leadership in advancement of the profession. She works and lives in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So I'll now hand it over to Jessica and Liesl for their presentation.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. All right, perfect. So let's see if I have control. Right. Okay, great. I'm going to repeat a little bit. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the research funding we received from the Canadian Foundation for Dietetic Research in 2022. This allowed us to explore how sustainability was being taught and supported in dietetics education and training in Canada. We declare that we have no relevant or material financial interest related to the research described in the presentation. And we would also like to thank the team at CFDR for hosting and organizing this webinar today. As I was introduced, my name is Jessica Wagner, and I'm presenting alongside my co-investigator, Liesl Carlson. Liesl did a webinar for Dietitians of Canada last Thursday, and one of the audience members asked about sustainability within Canadian dietetic education programs. So we are happy to dive into that question today. Our research partnership was established almost 6 years ago and includes Dr. Tracy Everett from St. Francis Xavier University. We are dietitians and educators interested in sustainability and are teaching in one of Canada's accredited dietetics programs. I also want to acknowledge that this research wasn't possible without the contributions of the undergraduate and graduate students who supported this work. Naomi Kareliak, a former undergraduate student at Acadia University, as well as Jacqueline Stokes and Katie Sauces, two former graduate students in the Nutrition Communication program at Toronto Metropolitan University. We would also like to thank the dietetic educators who participated in this research, particularly during a very busy and difficult time in Canadian dietetic education, who shared their perspectives with us on teaching sustainable food systems in Canada. I am joining you today from my campus, where Toronto and Toronto Metropolitan University are in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And when my parents immigrated to Canada from Europe, we were invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I also acknowledge that Liesl is presenting from Acadia University, which is located in the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples, and covered by the peace and friendship treaties, which recognize ongoing relationships of respect, cooperation, and stewardship. So, in the context of today's discussion on sustainable food systems education and dietetics, this acknowledgement reminds us that food systems, land stewardship, and nutrition are deeply interconnected, and that Indigenous knowledge systems have long sustained healthy relationships with people, food, and the environment, and ought to be a more central focus in our teaching on sustainable food systems. Our agenda today includes an overview of the CFDR funded project, including background work that led to the project and the specific research questions we explored. We will give you a brief overview of the methodology and focus on the results from our surveys and interviews with dietetic educators. If you are an educator here today and looking to further develop your courses to include sustainability, we hope that we can leave you with some key insights, as well as a list of resources and practical tools that you can use. So by way of background, the CFDR funded project that we will describe today is part of a larger research program focused on sustainability in dietetic practice broadly and includes both national and international projects. I'll mention the International Mapping Project briefly. It's shown in the top left quadrant of the slide as it relates to the CFDR funded work, and Lisa will later tie in some of the other recent projects. So our interest in sustainability in dietetic and nutrition education started back in 2022, 21, when our team started mapping the degree of sustainable food systems coverage in accredited dietetic and nutrition programs in several countries, including Canada. So we looked at the UK, Ireland, Australia, the US, and Canada, and using a sustainability metric to assess course calendar descriptions across 23 accredited dietetics programs, we found that only 8 courses or Canadian courses reference sustainability or sustainable food systems based on online or available online course descriptions. So, of these 8 courses, 2 considered sustainability alone without a reference to food systems. 4 were offered as a single lecture or topic covered in a course, and only 2 courses were dedicated to the topic of sustainable food systems, and both were offered at the undergraduate level. I'll pass it over to Liesel to expand on some of the foundational background that supports greater consideration of healthy and sustainable dietary patterns in dietetic education and practice.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for the introductions and to all of you who are in the room listening. So what are sustainable food systems and why the interest in sustainability and food systems education and nutrition and dietetic education programs? We refer to the FAO or the World Health Organization and the FAO definition, which defines healthy, sustainable dietary patterns as those that promote all dimensions of health, have low environmental impact, are safe, affordable, accessible, and equitable, and are important to human and planetary health. Translated into well-evidenced operational principles to guide dietary patterns that would meet that visionary definition. This includes breastfeeding, shifting towards more plant-sourced foods, especially legumes and fruits and vegetables, although I will give some conditions that one is geographically contextual, engaging in seasonal, local food and territorial food systems, choosing certified foods, limiting consumption of processed foods, reduction of food waste and food-related waste, and moderating consumption. Next slide, please. So what I've just read out are things that are the purview of nutritionists and dietitians in Canada. Our practice concern was that these topics, the ones that I've just gone over at a really high level, are recognized as important. And so, for example, they show up in Canadian competency standards, and increasingly they're recognized as within the scope of dietetics practice among international practitioners and national dietetics associations around the world, including Canada. However, dietitians do not feel adequately prepared to teach and train students in sustainable food systems. And this is not new. This phenomenon was recognized as early as 2011 in Alison Harmon's work in Montana. And we have been finding similar evidence to this in the Canadian research. And also internationally, we see this both showing up in education programs and in practice. And so there is a gap between this recognition of importance and not feeling adequately prepared to do a thorough job of incorporating it into our programs. Next slide, please. So we already knew, based on the international mapping research that Jessica just introduced, that in Canada, sustainable food systems, or sustainability and food systems related topics, are being taught, but to a very limited degree. And we wanted to know further how it was being taught. So to really look more closely beyond course descriptions, to see what's, if we could sort of peel back the layers and see, well, maybe there are components that were missed in the original piece, or maybe there are ways that it's being taught that we're not capturing. So the purpose of the CFDR funded research that we're sharing today was to gain a greater depth of understanding about sustainability and food systems and how it's showing up in our education and training programs in Canada, with the goal of supporting educators so that they can feel prepared to teach it and that future dietitians are much better prepared to play leadership roles in this area. Next slide, please. We asked a set of very specific questions. We asked about how are sustainable food systems concepts being taught in Canadian dietetic programs? What gaps exist? Are there examples of highly effective sustainable food systems related education courses or modules that are being taught, or ways that they're being taught? And probably most importantly, and we'll share this today, is what supports are required by educators to do this work and to do it really well. Next slide, please. So how did we go about doing our work? We developed, tested, and launched a web-based questionnaire for dietetic educators who we consider to be anyone involved in teaching at the undergraduate or graduate level, teaching to students or dietetic trainees in an accredited dietetics program in Canada in the past 5 years. So we focused on accredited programs, and we focused on the last 5 years. The last 5 years is important for several reasons, but an example could be, an example could be that many universities maybe only offer a course every other year. So we wanted to make sure that we could capture what has been and is currently happening. So this included, in terms of educators, who did this include? It included directors of programs, it included professors and instructors and lecturers, and internship or practicum coordinators who teach into the programs. It did not include guest lecturers or those who are providing a small portion of a course and are not responsible for the overall content of the course. We recruited through contact information that we had, contact information on program websites, professional networks, and then snowball sampling. The purpose of phase 2, after our questionnaires, was to interview those who participated in the questionnaire, and sometimes those who didn't, but reach out to us to say that they still have information to share. And the purpose of those interviews was to really explore in depth what are the perceptions around sustainable food system coverage within their program, what are their really specific barriers, to be able to talk about them in much more detail, to understand the context of what some of those barriers are, to look at the departmental and institutional supports and barriers that are happening beyond the course level. And we did those interviews over the course of 1 year. Next slide, please. And then we analyzed that data in order to produce some of the findings that Jessica's going to talk about a little bit later. So what we're sharing today comes from 16 educators representing 11 dietetics programs in Canada. As a side note, we aim to hear from at least one person from each of the accredited dietetics programs in Canada, of which there were approximately 17 eligible programs. So we had about a 65% response rate. We heard from full-time faculty members, part-time faculty members, instructors, coordinators, staff educators, etc. We heard about 17 different sustainable food systems related courses, and they were both primarily at the undergraduate, but some at the at the graduate level. What I think is really important to note here is that because we were hearing from 16 educators and 11 programs, but we had 17 courses, it means that some educators and some programs have multiple courses that are related to this topic, which is a good thing. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. An important note around methodology and who we heard from, the goal was actually not to obtain a representative sample of Canadian educators, because what we're not doing is looking at causality. What we're doing is looking at educators who have already begun to teach into this topic and who have really strong lived experience to share with us about what works and what doesn't work and why. Next slide, please. The questions in our survey and the questions, in our questionnaire, but then also in our interviews related to instructors and then also related to courses. So instructor related questions, we're exploring readiness to incorporate sustainable food systems into their courses, what their preparation needs were, what barriers and supports were required, and their perceptions around gaps in student knowledge and skills. And we did ask about their perceived understanding of entry level to practice students around sustainable food systems. We also asked about the course. So while the mapping project that Jessica described earlier was just really looking at course descriptions, which tend to be publicly available, we were asking about more in-depth information around learning objectives within the course, around which topics were being covered specifically, about what frameworks or definitions people were using to define sustainable food systems. And then we were also looking at course level details to understand from a pedagogical perspective what level of knowledge were students gaining. Were they getting a lecture? Were they doing case studies? Were they doing experiential learning? So each of those really changes how one is learning and what one is learning about. Okay, so from here, I'm going to turn it back to Jessica, who's going to share some of our findings.
Great. Thank you. So in addition to hearing about educator readiness to incorporate sustainable food systems into teaching and about what educators need to feel more prepared, the findings that we will present today will focus on how sustainable food systems are being, concepts are being taught, the perceived barriers, as Liesl noted, and the institutional and program level and professional supports that were identified by educators. I just have to move a few things around, sorry. So from how are sustainable food systems concepts being taught? So from the analysis of our educator survey, we could see that for the majority of dietetic education programs in this study, sustainable food systems concepts are taught in a single university course rather than integrated across multiple courses and program years. This was true in 64% of the undergraduate programs and all three of the graduate programs in the study. We could also see that Canadian graduate students in an accredited dietetics graduate program are more likely to be required to take a sustainable food systems related course. This is compared to our undergraduate students who can elect, or it's optional, to take a course related to sustainable food systems. They are often offered as electives. Our respondents reported a high degree of variability in the amount of sustainable food systems coverage in their courses. So approximately 40% of the courses described by participants were estimated to dedicate about 50% of the course to sustainable food system concepts. So in a 12-week course, maybe half, 6 weeks, cover sustainable food systems concepts. The average was around 66%. And they often introduced one or more dimensions of sustainability related to environmental, social, or economic dimensions. Educators use a variety of frameworks and resources. However, none of these were consistently used or common across programs. This is except for the Dietitians of Canada Sustainable Food Systems roll paper. This was released in July 2020, and the 2019 Eat Lancet Commission report. Sustainable food systems was most often described as being taught through lectures, class discussions, and for some programs through community service learning. This is a type of experiential learning in which students engage in purposeful and structured learning experiences in partnership with nonprofit or public organizations to address a need identified by the community. In terms of, so what do dietetic educators describe as barriers to teaching sustainable food systems? Now my quote is hidden here, so I'll have to move something around again, sorry. So in terms of some of the barriers to teaching sustainable food systems, the most common ones related to program realities, course challenges, and instructor knowledge gaps. So in terms of program realities, some examples included an already packed dietetics curriculum. This is based on the current education and training standards. Making it difficult for instructors to develop new sustainable food systems related courses or to expand existing ones to include sustainable food systems concepts. Another program reality was the effect of recent university and program spending cuts, which limited human resources for a position like a lab coordinator or a community placement coordinator to support field trips and other types of experiential learning. Respondents described several course-related challenges, barriers that were seen to be related to a course rather than to a program. These included competing content priorities in a given course, having limited class time to cover sustainable food systems topics fully, limited theoretical hours requiring instructors to prune some theoretical concepts to add in sustainability, and connected to that, a lack of appropriate and relevant sustainable food systems content related to the Canadian context. Lastly, there were gaps in general and specific knowledge of sustainable food systems among educators, which were presented as a barrier to teaching. Specific knowledge gaps included interdisciplinary knowledge and Indigenous knowledge related to sustainable food systems. Knowledge gaps were also identified among students, and more than one respondent identified that as students being more comfortable with a reductionist approach to nutrition and food practice and less comfortable with a systems thinking approach. One respondent reflected this challenge like this, and again, I'm sorry, I have to move things around. Students often want to know knowledge and answers in sustainable food systems. Sustainable food systems is so value and process laden, which makes it challenging to teach, often limited to a couple of classes. So from our in-depth interviews, we heard more about the kinds of supports that were needed by educators to teach sustainable food systems effectively and to ensure that students or future dietitians are prepared to play leadership roles in facilitating healthy and sustainable dietary practices or dietary patterns. These fell into three main areas related to institutional, program level, and professional supports, and I will go over each one of these separately. So, in terms of what academic institutions can do to support sustainable food systems education, educators identify the need for university-wide interdisciplinary connections between sustainable food systems experts to enable impactful sustainable food systems teaching. For those institutions that we saw that were doing this well, this looked like an open elective course dedicated to sustainable food systems and co-instructed by experts across various departments and faculties. In some cases, this type of university-wide course with multiple co-instructors from different academic disciplines was housed within the dietetics department or nutrition program so that its development and content could be overseen by dietetic educators and aligned with the dietetic competencies. When it's housed within a nutrition department or nutrition program, it could also be intentionally offered as a mandatory or core course for dietetic students as a requirement for graduation. This kind of institutionally supported and interdisciplinary course was noted as an important way to overcome some of the key knowledge gaps that were identified by many dietetic educators, in that students and instructors could benefit from the expertise of multiple co-instructors to facilitate a deeper, broader understanding of the complexity of food systems and its stakeholders. Institutional grants were also noted as an important support for educators. As we know, experiential learning has been shown to enhance student understanding of sustainable food systems, offering a real-world or hands-on way to gain knowledge and relevant skills. So institutional one-time or one-off grants or dedicated funding to facilitate experiential learning opportunities, such as for a lab coordinator, a community placement or community placement coordinator for student placements, were noted examples. So institutions can also enhance learning opportunities for students by providing honoraria for guest speakers with unique sustainable food systems expertise, such as Indigenous leaders and elders, who could offer students a deeper appreciation and understanding of Indigenous food systems and Indigenous ways of knowing. Institutions can also provide meaningful spaces to enhance student learning around sustainable food systems. So one of our participants described an example of an active learning classroom to support sustainable food systems education. This is shown in one of the upcoming slides, so you'll see it in a moment. But this promotes Indigenous history and culture, offers a space for collaborative learning, and brings nature into the classroom. In terms of some of the program enablers, we heard from educators that intentional departmental planning with buy-in and support from faculty can facilitate coordinated or scaffolded sustainable food systems integration across multiple courses and program years. So one of the key barriers we heard was that sustainable food systems was often isolated or boxed into a single course in most dietetic programs. Not all, but in most programs. The process of accreditation and accreditation renewal was noted as a strength and opportunity for dietetic programs to evaluate the curriculum, assess where sustainable food systems content could be better integrated, and to consider the knowledge and skill needs of future dietitians, particularly with respect to sustainability and food systems. The process of curriculum mapping was identified as a program level support that could help clarify where sustainable food systems is currently covered and identify gaps in the curriculum where sustainable food systems could be strengthened or better integrated. Opportunities to discuss and establish agreement on a comprehensive definition of sustainable food systems and clear learning outcomes was also suggested as a way for departments or schools of nutrition, in terms of how they could promote greater sustainable food systems coverage across their curriculum. Lastly, a sustainable food system advisor role offered by a faculty member with expertise in sustainable food systems was suggested as a way to guide the integration of sustainable food systems across courses within the program. Professional and program level supports, including practical teaching resources and professional development opportunities, were also identified. Specifically, educators identified the need for case studies, infographics, videos, resource banks, and sample curricula that align with sustainable food systems informed dietetic competency standards. The ICDEPs, or the Integrated Competencies for Dietetic Education and Practice, were discussed as the most critical driver for curricular change. The ICDEPs provide the mandate for what is taught in Canadian dietetics programs, education programs, and at present are perceived as a barrier for two reasons. The lack of First reason is the lack of explicit, detailed, sustainable food systems competency statements and measurable key performance indicators. And the second relates to the observation that, as one participant stated, sustainability appears to be positioned as a specialty over an area that needs to be threaded into all of dietetics. So national dietetic associations can support sustainable food systems education by offering professional development opportunities that not only highlight the importance of sustainable food systems, but also showcase how dietitians are integrating sustainability across various practice areas. Lastly, dietetic educators noted the need for expanded pedagogy. Dietetic associations like Dietitians of Canada, funding agencies like CFDR that support pedagogically oriented research, as well as internal university funding, program funding for new course development can enable ongoing work in this area. And as mentioned, support experiential learning opportunities that strengthen systems thinking and expose students to diverse perspectives. So, despite the growing interest in a keen interest in students, educators willing to teach the content, I'll turn it over now to Liesl, who will highlight some of the critical gaps in sustainable food systems education in dietetics programs.
Okay, thanks so much, Jessica. Next slide, please. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm going to talk about the gaps that we're experiencing in education and dietetics programs. I'll just highlight two things before I get going. One is that, of course, because we're looking at supports and barriers, that there's going to be some overlapping themes as I'm talking that will sound very familiar because they've been drawn directly from the findings that Jessica was highlighting. So there'll be some repetition in terms of how we position those. My experience as an educator is repetition is never a bad thing. And I also just want to highlight the chat. Thank you to those who have begun to introduce yourself. There's a few things I just wanted to point out, and that is I see that a number of people are listening in from countries outside of Canada, which is fantastic. And so what I really hope is that some of the pieces that we're going to share are going to be useful at an international level. And some of the pieces that we're going to share a little bit later on about the tools that we're developing will be very relevant to our participants who are coming in from outside of Canada. Okay, so the gaps in sustainable food system education and dietetics programs were clustered into three main topic areas. So these include a lack of coordinated, scaffolded program-wide sustainable food systems coverage, a minimum curriculum dependent on the instructor, and the need for expanded pedagogy for effective sustainable food systems learning. And I'll provide a brief overview of each of these findings in turn and describe them in more detail. Next slide, please. So the first key gap was a lack of coordinated, scaffolded program-wide sustainable food systems coverage spanning dietetics programs. So Jessica began to explain where this is coming from and what it means. Just as a reminder, what we're talking about here is the challenge that of the undergraduate programs in our study, approximately half required nutrition students to take a course related to sustainable food systems. So that means that, in the Canadian context, we're hoping that approximately half of those entry-level practitioners who are coming into the profession will have been exposed to the idea at least. Many programs also isolated sustainable food systems concept into a single course if these concepts were covered in the curriculum. So that could actually reduce that number even a little bit more. And so that creates a lack of coordination or lack of systematic approach to what needs to happen here. Also important is that for many instructors, this lack of coordinated, scaffolded coverage of sustainable food systems encourage students to view sustainable food systems as a special topic as opposed to something that is central to how we practice. Another example of how this might really hit home is that within nutrition and dietetics, we do a very good job of the social determinants of health. So while we may learn about the social determinants of health in one course within the dietetics program and think about them theoretically, they are then generally integrated into how we do many of our other course-related work or course-related learning, and certainly when we do practicum-related learning. Likewise, we might see that in a topic like equity. Equity is not something that you think about as a checkbox that happens after all the other work is done. Equity is a lens through which you look when you're doing all the work that you're doing, regardless of practice area. And so what I think our educators were saying to us is that by isolating it into specific courses and sometimes non-mandatory courses, it's not only optional information, but it's an add-on or a specific topic. And this quote on the slide here is a great way to describe that and has informed the title of the paper where we share this work. We cannot box it into one course. It needs to get into these other courses so that we have people who are very conscious about sustainability right from the beginning. The other piece about scaffolding for the non-pedagogues in the room is that it is important that it gets introduced early and then built on throughout the course of a generally 4-year degree. So the same concept is being introduced and then built on in terms of level and depth of knowledge that's required, just like we do with most of our other dietetic education. Okay, next slide, please. The second gap that was really important that we identified was a minimum curriculum dependent on the instructor. So the context and the depth, the content and the depths of the sustainable food system education are highly dependent on the individual instructor's readiness, initiative, expertise, and experience. So on that note, and as a side, only 1/3 of our respondents felt ready and prepared to teach sustainable food systems. So that's really, really important. If we have really unclear minimum standards and most people are not feeling prepared, we can end up with patching things in here and there, which is a great quote that comes next. So we have no standard text to follow or minimum criteria necessarily, or explicit competencies that are dictated to us, resulting in an enormous amount of additional preparation time for anyone who's teaching these courses, which can become a problem. So for the educators in the room, one of the things that you might be thinking, yes, isn't this true of all of the things that we're teaching? To a certain degree, but I would actually argue that most of the content in our curriculum has been well established for long enough that those who are teaching, so whether that's in the university environment or preceptors in the practical environment, they have either learned the theory through pedagogical work at the university, through textbooks, through standard textbooks. Many topics have standard textbooks, or practitioners who have a tremendous amount of experience in the field. So trying to isolate what's important and what's foundational knowledge is not different. What's challenging with the sustainable food systems topic is that it's quite new to practice. So we're trying to sort of build what those minimum standards are while we're also teaching them. And so for those of you in the room who are in the process of doing this, it's an enormous amount of work to try and also isolate and understand those things. So this bringing things together, or sort of bringing in what you're hoping is going to be most relevant, can become really, really challenging. So just to highlight again what Jessica has talked about, is participants told us very clearly they're really looking to Professional Dietetics Association for practice relevant examples that they can use. They're looking to institutions to support and establish interdisciplinary collaborations and networking opportunities so that they can work with others who are experts in sustainability and food systems, but from other disciplines, who can bring aspects of the knowledge that's not necessarily housed as nutrition and dietetics knowledge. So that's a really important piece. So one of the gaps is this lack of understanding about what a minimum curriculum is. Next slide, please. So the third gap that Jessica spoke to in some of our research findings that she presented is identified as pedagogy for effective sustainable food systems learning. So we really need to consider how dietetics programs can deliver transformative and systems engaged pedagogy in Canadian dietetic education. And this, I think, will resonate with educators, students, and learners in the room, is that sustainable food systems and related topics can be taught as theory in the classroom, but translating that theory and bridging it to action in practice is a major concern without experiential learning. So for most of the topics that are critical and foundational knowledge to nutrition and dietetics practice, we integrate experiential learning in labs, in case studies, and then eventually in our practical training, so that students are really well set up to take theory learned in the classroom and put it into practice. That is so far only happening in a very ad hoc way with respect to sustainability and food systems in Canadian programs. So some of the things that get in the way of that is limited class time and competing priorities within the curriculum. I think we can all relate to what we call the packed dietetics curriculum, an enormous core of information that students need to learn in a very short amount of time before they move out into practice, gets in the way of this sort of concept or this perception that we need to add more to our curriculum. Insufficient dedicated staff, and that is often a resource related challenge. So in order to be able to do really effective, transformative, and practice oriented learning where we can bridge theory to practice, we need to be doing and applying the work. That type of knowledge and that type of learning at a university takes time, and it often takes a tremendous amount of coordination time. So course coordinators who can help with some of that engaged learning piece. In addition to that, we often rely on community coordinators or community members who are working within or outside of dietetics, who take our students and provide these tremendous learning experiences. But we're relying for the most part on this to be happening on top of people's regular jobs. So really, we're really challenged by resourcing pedagogy for really effective learning. Another barrier or gap that was identified was lack of funding for guest speakers. This became very, very obvious when we were talking to our participants about Indigenous knowledge and integrating Indigenous knowledge of food systems and sustainability into our dietetics programs. So Indigenous guest speakers in particular, but all guest speakers deserve to be and need to be compensated for their time and sharing the knowledge that they have. But most universities don't have a separate fund to pay guest speakers. It's sort of assumed that it's going to happen for free. And that creates significant equity issues, in particular as it relates to Indigenous knowledge in our classrooms. And the final one was inadequate physical infrastructure. So for example, teaching kitchens or adequate lab or experiential learning spaces for our students to be able to do what they're doing. Jessica gave a great example and then showed a picture of a classroom that's set up in a different way that has a physical infrastructure that's slightly different than how we normally do. So that's a really important part. Okay, next slide, please. So from this, we've developed recommendations, and through our recommendations, we hope to address the gaps that I've just synthesized at the end. For the most part, these recommendations are aimed at institution level. So that could be public health institutions, that could be university institutions, it could also be national dietetics associations, in order to be able to support educators to do what they do best. So a number of these we're actually starting to address through other projects that Jessica, Tracy, and I have been working on, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. So recommendation number one, increase sustainable food systems specificity within competency standards. So we have taken a look at internationally how sustainability is incorporated, and there are examples of other countries with a significant amount of more specificity than what we have in Canada. But there are some trade-offs to this, and I will talk about that in the next slide and how we might be able to start to address this. But right now, because of the gaps around minimum curricular, a clear understanding of minimum curriculum, the competency standards currently don't support educators to be able to decide what's minimum curriculum. The second one is to develop curriculum resources and tools for consistent training. And so paired together, recommendation 1 and 2 could take a number of different forms, and I'll describe that later. So again, our team is starting to work on curriculum resources and tools that can be used to shape competency standards, and I'll provide more detail on the next slide. The third recommendation is to embed sustainable food system curriculum throughout education, training to promote systems engaged pedagogy. So while recommendation 1 may be more suited to national dietetics associations, 2 and 3 are aimed at educators with support from, or education institutions with support from national dietetics associations. Recommendation number 4 is really for everybody. And so for the educators in the room, it's a really important one to pay attention to. So signaling importance and claiming space. And what we mean by this is that there's no question amongst practitioners and amongst leaders in this field that these are really important questions, and this is really important knowledge and practice that we need to be able to learn. So sort of squeezing it into a quick lecture in your 3rd year of university, we all recognize as not adequate. So signaling the importance and justifying and asking for the resources it will take to produce really good learning environments where we can educate and graduate leaders in this field is really, really important. So it will take additional funding in order to set up the spaces, the community partners, the coordinators to do this type of learning and integrate it into what we're doing. Next slide, please. So what are we doing? So Jessica and I, together with Dr. Tracy Everett, who is at St. FX, was introduced on the very first slide, are working together with our international partners to begin to address some of these recommendations that we already have. This project that we shared with you today has been a tremendous support in providing a platform to begin to follow through on some of these recommendations, because it's allowed us to build relationships that moved us into this next phase. So the first piece that we're doing that I will focus on highlighting, but we do have other things we can share, maybe we can take it in the question and answers, is that we're working on a sustainable food systems framework that's globally relevant. So what we're looking for is one that's co-designed by educators, that's fit for purpose and evidence informed. The purpose of this global framework that we're working on is to hit that perfect balance between adequate guidance with enough flexibility that can be adapted at the regional level. And one of the things about sustainable food systems and sustainability related work is it is only relevant if it can be translated at a local level in a way that's contextual, if it's going to be effective for change. The intention for this work is to point to what principles should be included in sustainable food systems education at that foundational level. So as all entry-level practitioners, we end up with foundational level, and then we have the rest of our careers to build expertise in certain areas. But what is that foundational level is what we're asking. And we're hoping that this tool could be helpful to accompany very general competency standards, such as the ones we have in Canada, or to provide guidance or help to inform more specific competency standards, if that's the way that, you know, Canadian competency standards or other international competency standards go. The study that has informed the trustworthiness of the global framework that we're working on is in press. So we're really hoping that we can share that with people soon. And it's been informed by participants from multiple countries around the world. The practical tool that follows this study that we've done is under development. And again, we're really happy to share that with participants when that becomes available. We generally share our work through the Sustainable Food Systems Network at Dietitians of Canada. But on the next slide, you'll find our contact information. So we can, you can also reach out, and when they're ready, we can share them with the people in the room. Okay, so I'll end there. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to skip that one onto the thank you slide.
Okay. Great.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so thank you very much. We'd love to hear from participants about questions or comments that you want to share.
Thank you, Liesl and Jessica. That was fantastic. So much information and so much great work. We're starting to get a few questions in the Q&As, and I will go through them. I encourage everybody, if they have some questions, please ask them. All right, our first question is, do you have any references for the definition and efficacy of scaffolding?
I think we do in our paper, which is referenced on, I think, one of the slides. I think we have it. Where is our resources? Here at the bottom of the page here, if you can still see it. This is the paper that was published this January, and it's based on the presentation we did today. And there are some definitions there of scaffolding in the introduction.
Great, thank you.
Maybe not definitions, but the literature around scaffolding there. Yeah.
Right. All right, our second question, seeing the recommendation includes developing curriculum resources and improving competencies in pedagogy. How big of a barrier is the disappearance/extinction of PDEP? Do we currently have the systems in place that we need to move the work on these education-related recommendations?
Oh, could you read that question again?
Yes, it's also, if you want to look at it, it is in the
I
question
don't
and
have
answer.
the
Okay,
questions.
seeing the recommendation includes developing curriculum resources and improving competencies in pedagogy. How big of a barrier is the disappearance/extinction of PDEP? Do we currently have the systems in place that we need to move the work on these education-related recommendations?
That's a great question, Laura. Thank you for that. I don't know actually that I'm the best person to answer that question, because I think what you're getting at in the question is, you know, is the social infrastructure that that is going to replace PDEP. I think right now we're in a position where there's a lot that's unknown. Jessica made reference to that when we were talking about the challenge of getting people to engage in these topics at a time where this was really being rebuilt. So I don't know that we can answer that question. I think right now we're in an unknown time, but we do know that conversations are starting to happen about when and how are we going to update the current ICDEPs. If there's somebody in the room who wants to pop a note into the chat that may know more than we do about the background structure to what's happening with those ICDEPs, then we could direct it towards them.
Great. Okay, our next question. Do you have any information about how the identified courses or content cover not SFS content relevant to different practice areas? For example, SFS in clinical settings, food services, public health.
I'm just rereading the question.
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Is the question asking about how this gets covered in different courses? So a course covering clinical or food services or public health, is that what is being asked?
That's how I interpreted it.
I think so.
Okay, in which case I can speak to some of that. So when we were speaking with educators, in particular those who were working on community nutrition or public health related nutrition courses, those tended to be the courses where people felt much more comfortable including concepts of sustainability through topics like food security, community food security, social determinants of health, where it's a little easier to then layer on the ecological determinants of health. Where there's a lot less confidence is in clinically oriented courses, in particular because those courses already have a tremendous amount of knowledge content that needs to come in. What we're starting to see is sustainability related content being integrated into courses that set students up for food services. And that's because of the popularity and amount of press and amount of actually globally and publicly available resources around food waste, because a significant part of the conversation in food services is around food waste, which has been a very popular topic for a long time. So that one is one that I wouldn't say that it's being systematically integrated, but you certainly see more examples of it.
Okay, I think our next one is a little bit more of a comment than a question. I think we can collaborate with agriculture sector for better planning of sustainable food systems. And on that, I was wondering, do you have sort of any knowledge of other health professional groups that really sustainability is becoming a big thing with those groups?
Jessica, do you want to take that on or you want me to go?
Yeah, what comes to mind is a lot of the work that we're seeing coming out of the UK. A lot of the allied health professional groups. Now, Lisa, you'll have to help me. A lot of the names are escaping my brain at the moment, but we work closely with a colleague at Plymouth University who's been really involved in sharing a lot of the work from the UK with us in terms of core competencies for allied health professionals and the greening of healthcare. We see in the NHS, the National, oh gosh,
Health
National
services.
Health Services. Yeah. It's just been more of a mandate so we see a lot of our clinical dietitians in the UK integrating it more fully into their work. And I'm speaking not from my expertise on this research, but from another similar project that we're doing, what we call the SIPS research project. We didn't talk about it, but we got to talk to dietitians in the UK, Australia, the US, and in Canada. What are they doing and how are they integrating it? And it was very, very interesting to see the UK dietitians and the mandate around integrating sustainability into practice.
I'd love to add to a combination of Marcia, your question, and Mohammed's question. I think we are seeing fantastic examples internationally of collaboration with the agricultural sector and those involved in more the food and production end of things through concepts like nutrition sensitive agriculture, where you see nutrition professionals around the world working with the agricultural field to focus on agriculture that supports human health. And then to build on what Jessica said, other examples are through what is becoming more and more popular as a term is planetary health, which has really become a term through the Eat Lancet Commission. But so there's a lot of work happening with medical education. So education for doctors, nurses, and allied health professionals, all centering around that planetary health education. What's different for nutrition and dietetics educators around planetary health is that we tend to focus on food, whereas other health professionals are doing lots of human health work, but ours centers on food. Hence our focus on food and food systems and not just planetary health.
Thanks. Okay, one more question. How can we fully integrate it into curricula such as therapeutic nutrition?
Uh, Sustainable food systems, how can we fully integrate it?
Yes.
Um, yeah, I think, well, I'm not sure exactly how to answer this, but um, I think through sharing some examples of what we know is working, and that's what we're trying to do through a podcast series and another report where we've learned and asked dietitians in practice what they're doing. And so it's about sharing those stories of what is effective and how they're doing it. And then for educators to look at some of those teaching resources and then to say, this is how it is looking in practice. That's one way. We have colleagues who are doing it really well as educators, and we're learning from them and sharing their stories. Liesl, did you have anything else to add in terms of integrating it into therapeutic nutrition?
Yeah, I think of a couple of things. One is Jessica made mention of research that we've done in particular with UK dietitians, and I'm just hoping to pull up the paper. Yeah, there I've got the link for it. So we did publish one piece of work that, and I'll put it into the chat. So there is one piece of work that really examines integrating into nutrition and dietetic practice, not
Hmm.
curricula. But right now, what we're trying to acknowledge is this circular relationship between what's happening and what's needed in practice, informing what's happening within our education sector. And so that paper, I think, will start to help us to understand what needs to be included. And then, as Jessica mentioned, we're doing these podcasts where what we're trying to do also is share examples of
Hmm.
practitioners who are doing it and educators who are doing it. So hopefully for now, what we can do is help to build examples of how it gets integrated. And then lastly, we're really hoping that the curriculum framework will support
Hmm.
educators to do that.
Hmm.
All right. I'm mindful of the time and giving people back to wherever they're going, their workplaces. So thank you so much to Liesl and Jessica for sharing all this fantastic information with us. I think this is just really the start of the conversation. This is such a big topic and it's the way of the future. And I think we'll see more around the whole topic of sustainability. Thank you on behalf of CFDR and all our participants. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.